Good evening. My name is Marty Schickman, and I'm Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. I'm happy to welcome you here tonight, and thank you so very much for coming. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to thank a number of people and groups without whom our lecture wouldn't be possible. First and foremost, I want to express my appreciation to Harleen and Henry Appelman, whose wisdom and support has greatly enlivened our wintertime lecture series. Every year I ask Harleen for advice. Harleen is director of the Covenant Foundation, and every year she supplies me with a fabulous lecturer, and I believe we have one tonight. We're also indebted to the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, the EMU Department of Psychology, Hillel at EMU, HCAM, which is our Hillel umbrella organization, and Eastern Michigan University Campus Life. These organizations have been absolutely wonderful in sharing word about tonight's presentation. Tonight, the Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies is delighted to welcome Dr. Marshall P. Dyk, Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Psychology at Emory University, who will discuss the amazing power of family stories. Professor Dyk is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Family Life and author of 9 books and more than 100 articles focusing on the family and other social learning networks. He is a member of the core faculty of Emory's Center for the Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life and senior faculty fellow at Emory's Center for Ethics. And for academics like me, that stuff is really impressive and astonishingly important. But over the years, he has also appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. And that's the one that really knocked my socks off. I asked him if Oprah gave him a Buick, and he said she did not. His work has been written about in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Parents Magazine, and Time Magazine. So here we are, and it's Thanksgiving, a time for storytelling. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Marshall P. Dyk, who will talk to you about the amazing power of family stories. Thank you so very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marty, for a very kind introduction. I always, when asked about my appearance on Oprah, I always say that my most important achievement was getting her to sign a picture for my daughter, who was Oprah's greatest fan. And when my daughter got the picture, she placed it on the shelf right over the picture of her wedding picture with her husband. So thank you for having me, and I hope to tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing at Emory and elsewhere on the importance of family stories. I am by training a clinical psychologist, and so my interest initially in family stories, or narratives as we call them, family narratives, grew out of a concern that we needed to shift our orientation as psychologists, especially in working with children who have problems as they grow, but who, for the most part, get through life, or at least until a turning point in our history, get through life without too much stress and scary stuff happening. So let me tell you how I came to the point where I'm going to tell you about the amazing power of family stories, or why telling family stories is really important. And I'll tell you the end of the story at the beginning. Family stories are really important for kids to know about because it makes them more resilient. Knowing their family stories makes children more resilient, more capable of bouncing back from adversity. So how do we get from there back and then bring us back again to there. I want to tell you some stories. I want to tell you how we came to this conclusion. So go back with me, if you will, to 2001. I became part of what Marty described as the Center for the Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life at Emory University. And this project was funded by the Sloan Foundation, which was funding at that point 7 centers around the country designed to look at what was happening to the American family. They were concerned about the change in the way families lived. Economics required mom and dad both to work, and it was more common for kids to be coming home to empty houses, being so-called latchkey kids. They were safe. Moms and dads would make sure they were safe, but they would sometimes come into the house and they would get their milk and cookies on their own. Mom and dad might both be working. And if they were going to have activities, very often it was after school activities, soccer practices and baseball and things like this. Lots of things that would bring the family away from the house and spread them out all over the community. And they would sometimes be eating food in cars, at restaurants, and so on. And what was happening from the Sloan Foundation's perspective is that there were centrifugal forces. Now, centrifugal force is if, you spin around, there's a force that pushes you outward. And that's a force that moves you away from the center. What we were interested at the Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life, and I'll use the term MARIAL, which is the acronym for it. We were interested in centripetal forces, forces that bring people back together again. And over the years, there have been lots of centripetal forces in American families. Dinner time was certainly one of them. Kids would come home from school, they would have dinner at home, not every day, but pretty much that's what people did. Some people would come home for lunch, but there were times when people would be drawn together. And what Sloan Foundation was concerned about is that the families had been changing. What was the effect of that? So there were some centers looked at how people were drawn apart. We looked at how people were drawn together. The center comprised psychologists and sociologists, anthropologists, theologists, historians of the family, people from all different points of view. And myself, I was involved in the study of family stories, along with a colleague of mine whose name is Robin Fivish. Now, I mentioned Robin Fivish because I want to say that she has to be given credit for much of what we did. But she is also an expert in the development of narratives. How do families and individuals generate stories about their lives? Because generating a story about your life, knowing how things fit together, gives you a sense of continuity. And we kind of do that every day, is get some sense of the continuity in our lives. And this is through stories. As a clinical psychologist, I was interested in whether or not knowing family stories not only gave us a sense of continuity, but also was in some way immunizing, provided for us some sense of identity, which was healthful. So I mentioned that we started in 2001, and here's where part of the story picks up again, because in 2001, we had gotten a group of 40 families in the summer of 2001, and we had asked them all kinds of questions, visited their houses, interviewed them, tape recorded their dinner time conversations, did everything we possibly could to learn as much as we could about them, because we were going to try and learn how the way we were trying to live had affected them. And we knew a lot about them. And then came September 11th. There was the moment. No one would ever plan this as an experiment, September 11th, but in fact, it was what we call a naturally occurring experiment. It's an experiment no one would ever do or plan, but nonetheless, it happened. We are in another one of those now, by the way. We are in another naturally occurring experiment. The pandemic is a worldwide naturally occurring experiment. Nobody has planned it. But over the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to see an immense amount of research coming out on how families, how individuals dealt with this situation. But after 9/11, the same thing happened. We realized that we had had this event, and we realized that the families that we knew so much about might be willing to help us by telling us how they handled the problems that arose. And those of you who remember, the country stopped. We stayed in our houses. It wasn't like now, a year, 8 months, 10 months, a year soon. But people stayed in their houses and we locked down. But it turned out, like everything else, there were individual differences among the families. Some of the families seemed to bounce back faster than other families. Some of them kind of picked themselves up and got going. Some used some coping mechanisms that they had in place, but maybe hadn't planned to use in that kind of way. And we realized from a clinical psychology point of view that our job was no longer how do we prevent children from having problems as they grow up. Because when I was in training back in the 1970s, actually the 60s, but I want to appear younger. So back in the 1970s, we kind of believed that we could raise kids with a little bit of trouble. They would have problems, all kids do, but there wouldn't be any big major things that happened to them. But when 9/11 took place, it became clear that our job was not to prevent bad things from happening. Our jobs as parents, as teachers, as psychologists, was to how to build resilience in children, how to help them to develop in such a way that they would be able to bounce back from things like 9/11, how to bounce back from the pandemic, how to adjust to these things. That's our goal now as parents, teachers, as professionals. We need resilient kids. So the question now moved to how do we build resilience? What's associated with resilience? And so we went back to the families and we interviewed them more about how they recovered after 9/11. Meanwhile, my wife is a learning disabilities specialist, and she works with lots of kids who face lots of challenges in school. And she had worked with lots of kids. And she said to me, as I began working on this project, she said, you know, I've noticed something when I'm working with kids who are having problems in school. I often ask them about their families. And if you knew my wife, you know that she asked everybody all kinds of questions about everything. So this is not just a plan she had. She knows everything about the cashier at the supermarket before she leaves. But she asked the kids things like, you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know what school your mom went to? Do you know where your mom and dad, how did your mom and dad meet? And when my wife, Sarah, said to me, she says, you know, the kids who know more about their family background seem to be able to bounce back better in school. And so I'm a research psychologist. I'm compelled by her statement based on observation. And so we went back and we began to test this hypothesis, being the more kids know about their family background, the more resilient they are. That was the hypothesis that she stated, but we needed to gather data on this. And so we began a project in which we tried to really test this notion. First thing we did was we developed something called the Do You Know Scale, now known as the DYK scale, Do You Know? That's because all the questions in this scale begin with the phrase, do you know? And the questions we asked were things like I just exemplified. Do you know where your grandmother grew up? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know what happened on the day you were born? And we generated 20 of these questions. And the thing that made them important was that they asked about things that the child could not have known unless someone told him or her. All these things happened before the child experienced them. Hence, we were asking about information that needed to have been transmitted through a story. Someone had to tell them. And what we found, to take probably 5 years of research and compress it into a few minutes, we found that the more kids knew about their family background, the more resilient they were. Now, how are we going to define resilient? They had higher levels of measured self-esteem. They had higher levels of psychological functioning. Their families functioned better. The families as a group responded better to the stress of 9/11. Research at other locations using other measures, but nonetheless focused on family stories, found that the kids did better in school. They were more likely to avoid getting in trouble with the law. There were all kinds of things that were very positive that were associated with this single variable. That is, how much did they know about the history of their family? So this then became our hypothesis. It was, the more kids know about the history of their family, the more resilient they are, as defined by these psychological measures. Now, immediately what happened when Jane, I think it was Jane Brody from the New York Times, called us and wrote a very nice piece in her health column about our 20 questions. And soon thereafter, we had a call from Parents Magazine, and they said, we want to publish the 20 questions that children have to know the answers to in order to be resilient. Now, I hope, I can't see you out there, but I hope any of you who has even a little semblance of statistical knowledge knows that that's not a very good question, because it's a correlational question. We knew that more resilient kids knew more about their family background, but that's not causation. So we can't say that knowing about your family background makes you more resilient. We knew that those two things were connected in some significant way. But just knowing the answers to 20 questions wouldn't make kids resilient. There had to be something else. And so we began the process of trying to discover what this something else was. How is it that the kids came to know the history of their family? Many of you, if I have some grandparents out there, probably know the answer to this already, and that is that the kids hear stories about their families from their grandparents more typically than any other person. We also know that if it's going to be grandpa versus grandma, grandma is going to be the one who tells the stories more, although both grandparents typically tell stories. Now, so we began looking at the nature of these stories and when they were transmitted. Now, it turns out that we are at the #1 transmission time for stories in America. It is Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is a time, usually, that families gather together. And it's more so than even Christmas, because as a national non-sectarian holiday, Thanksgiving is an American holiday which involves gathering together as families. And more Americans will be doing that in any normal year than any other one single thing. At Thanksgiving tables, at gatherings at beaches and country houses and by lakes, and people tell stories. And the stories are transmitted from the adults to the children, sometimes in formal ways, like we're going to sit down and have storytelling time, but sometimes just informal stories. And the stories are told and told and told and told. And I say that in that way because the same stories are told very frequently, and the little kids begin to absorb them. Now, here's something that we learned about the stories. The stories are almost always sort of true, but they are never completely true because of the nature of stories. When they're told, they're embellished sometimes, and sometimes people leave out something that might have happened that they forgot. And the same story might be told differently from time to time. Not only that, siblings or other members of a family might have different versions of the same family story, but over time, the kids develop a sense of a family narrative. Now, we were concerned as we did this as to whether or not the kids were right. Did they really know the family story? So we did a study with about 100 families where we asked the kids, do you know all these sorts of things? And then we asked the child's parent what the answer was to the question. You know, where did grandma grow up? And we asked mom, where did your mother grow up? And we used that as the level or the determinant of accuracy. Well, it turned out that a lot of times the kids did not have the correct answers to the questions, but they had answers to the questions. And it turned out further that the accuracy was important, but not crucial. In other words, they needed to have a story that they felt belonged to them and that they received from people who were important in their family. So they needed to have a family narrative. They needed the story, but it didn't have to be completely accurate. And that's good because the stories are not always completely accurate. Okay, so now we know that the kids have stories and that they've received these stories from parents, grandparents, and how is this relationship between knowledge of family history and resilience explained? Well, we still didn't have that. We knew they had the stories, but having the stories and resilience, what's the connection? How does it work? So we went to a sociologist, the work of a sociologist by the name of Zerubbabel. Don't have to remember, there's no test, but he's an Israeli sociologist, anthropologist, and he has studied the shape of family stories, the shape of family stories. And what do I mean by the shape? He says that a family narrative has a number of possible shapes or forms if you look at it. Once you take the entire family story and you look at it from a distance, you see that there are three major types, three major family story shapes. The first of them would be called an ascending family narrative. Now, an ascending family narrative is essentially something like, when we came to this country, we had nothing. We came with just a few dollars in our pocket and we worked hard, or we were very lucky or something. But the story is that we got better. And so we're doing okay right now, but it wasn't always that way. And then there's a descending family narrative. The descending family narrative says, we used to have a lot. We were a very successful family. And then the depression hit, or there was a terrible illness or tragedy or something happened, and we have descended from that. And we're not doing as well now. That's the family story, descending narrative. But what Zerubbabel described as the most common of the family story shapes, and the most common that we have found, is what we call the oscillating family narrative. Oscillating family narrative. That is, the story includes both good times and bad times. Times that the family was challenged, times that the family was not doing very well at all. And then the narrative typically describes an effort to try and rise back up from the down point and come back up again. And most families have stories that are shaped like that. Now, if you talk to older people about the family narrative, we have been through financial downturns in the 80s, 2008. We have been through, some of us, my age, have been through the polio pandemic. And so we've got stories to say, yep, that's how I wasn't allowed to go out of the house for summer after summer. I couldn't go to swimming pools. I couldn't do this kind of stuff. But here I am. See, there's this unspoken message, which essentially says, these bad things happened in the history of our family or of our culture, of our people. But look, we're here. We're having Thanksgiving dinner and things are okay. So without telling you in words, what I'm telling you is that even though things get bad, we come back from that. That's the oscillating family narrative. It says things are down, but then they come back. The stock market goes down and everything's terrible. And then it might take 10 years, but it will come back. The pandemic comes and we're locked in our houses, but look what's happening. There are people doing research. As Mr. Rogers always said to kids to try and calm them down. You know, Mr. Rogers was famous for saying, if there's something scary going on around you, look for the helpers, he would say. Look for the helpers. Look for the firemen, for the policemen. Look for the medical researchers now who are trying to find the vaccine to free us from this. And we're watching for the helpers. But if we're looking at the long narrative, isn't it interesting? 1918 appeared immediately in the news about what happened then. And we're looking and we're saying, wow, 1918, look at what happened. But we're here. Our people are here. Certainly people were sick and many people died. But we're here now. So we have resilience. We have the capacity to rise up. Now, how does this explain the relationship between knowledge of this story and resilience? Well, Robin Fivish, my colleague, whose name I mentioned before, has developed during her years in research a concept which I want to give to you. And it's a concept which she calls the intergenerational self. Intergenerational self. So we know what a self is, or at least we hope that we know what a self is. You know, this feeling of who we are, our sense of identity. But she says there's something called an intergenerational self, a self that goes between generations. And here's what she means by this. It means that if I'm 10 and I hear a story about my parents, then I go back another 30 years or so. I'm suddenly like 40. But if I hear about my grandparents, I'm going back another 20, 30, 40 years. I'm now 70 years back, 80 years back. I have a connection that goes back far longer than I've been alive. But I am part of that narrative because that narrative belongs to me. It's been given to me in the form of stories that belong to my family. So this sense of intergenerational self creates in us a lot of really odd things. For one, it creates a sense that we have been places or experienced things that we didn't really experience at all. The poet Billy Collins, and I can't quote this poem completely, but Billy Collins, the poet, has a poem called Fishing on the Susquehanna River. And in it, he begins by saying, I've never fished on the Susquehanna River. I've never sat in a boat with my line held out and the rod in my hand. I've never felt the splash of the water coming on me as the oars rowed the boat. I've never felt the tug of the fish on my line. I've never seen it break the water and flip back and forth. You see what he's doing. And he ends the poem by saying, I've never been fishing on the Susquehanna. But in fact, what he does in his poem is gives us all the experience through a story, through a poem in this case, of fishing on the Susquehanna, to the point where, because we've heard the story of it, we feel as if it really happened to us. Now, given this trans or intergenerational self, we now have a situation in which kids have not only their own life experience, but the experiences of their entire family, which have been given to them, and they can turn to or rely upon not their own experiences, but the experiences that they have heard about and now own to deal with situations that arise. So if this pandemic occurs now, the kids who know from stories that we've told them about what happens when there's illness like this or a challenge like this, they know that by looking at us and how we're dealing with it and by what we've told them, that we will come through it, that we are resilient. They don't have to have experienced directly the things that we tell them about, but the knowledge that we went through them and that we came through them helps them to become more resilient in the face of things that they've never ever been faced with. Not only that, I wasn't around 1918. It looked like, but I wasn't. But I'm hearing about 1918. I'm looking at pictures and I'm seeing people with masks as you have, and they are doing all these things that we're doing now. And we say to ourselves, okay, well, that's how we get through it. That's how we get through it. So the intergenerational self provides this vehicle through which kids can make adjustments when situations arise that they have never, ever experienced on their own. As adults, if we see a downturn in the economy, we don't like it. We deal with it. We have to deal with it. But we also know that over time, because it's oscillating, we will come back from that. So we had come to this point about the importance of family stories and had focused on where the family stories are transmitted. I mentioned Thanksgiving because it's a big one, but there are also birthdays, weddings, funerals, where people gather together, where stories are told. So there's lots of opportunities for the stories to be told. Those are the big stories, but there are also the smaller stories that contribute to the identity of the child. And these are dinner time stories, family dinners. When people sit down, as they do when they can, and now they're probably doing it more than ever, but in pre-pandemic times, people would have dinners maybe 2 or 3 times a week together. And by the way, Columbia University's study on alcohol, drug addiction has found that it's important to have family dinners, but 3 family dinners a week are as good as 5 or 7. So it's not that we have to feel terrible about not having 7, but we should feel terrible if we have none. We need to have 2 or 3 where we gather together, because during the daily gathering, what we have is an opportunity to transmit what are called today I stories. What is a today I story? What did you do in school today? Well, today I, and then you have a story. And kids tell what happened, and mom tells what happened, and dad tells what happened. And they're building the family narrative by these today I stories on a daily basis. Sunday dinner, Friday night Sabbath meals. When people gather together as a group, it turns out are pretty important. Now, we would have kind of remained at maybe a semi-visible level with this research had it not been for the wonderful intervention of the New York Times columnist Bruce Feiler. Bruce Feiler, who is a well-known writer, Walking the Bible, and a book recently came out called Life's Transitions, or Life is in the Transitions. Well, Bruce Feiler found out about our research somehow. And I was sitting at home one day, and my cell phone rang, and I answered, and he said, "Hello, this is Bruce Feiler. Do you know what I do?" And I said, "Yeah, you work for the Times." He says, "Yes." And he said, "I'd like you to ask me to dinner at your house." And of course, I said, "Okay, is there any reason you want to do that?" He says, "I want to talk to your grandchildren. I want them all to be there, because I want to see if they know the stories of your family. And I want to learn about what they know and how they came to know it." I had no worries about this because we tell family stories. And he was not trying to catch us. He just wanted to see what it was like. And so Bruce Feiler came to our house and had dinner. And he interviewed our kids and our grandchildren. And sure enough, thank goodness, they knew all the stories of the family, many of which arose at Hilton Head Island on Thanksgiving. Now, that brings me to a point I want to make about this particular Thanksgiving, because our family has gone to Hilton Head Island for Thanksgiving for 40 years. And this is the first year that we will not be doing that. And this, probably many of you have a sentence which begins, "This is the first year that we will not." And that means that this year is a very special one. It's got to go into our family stories, into our family narratives. But we went to Hilton Head and we do all sorts of family activities. And the kids knew about this, and this was part of the family narrative. It was part of the family story. It's very important to all of them. And what Bruce Feiler realized was that this became part of their identity, and he wrote about this in a couple of columns, and he wrote about this in some of his books, and actually gave us a lot of publicity, which got people very interested in the research. And it turns out that lots of people are telling family stories. You don't need me to tell you that family stories are good. What you do need me to tell you, though, is that telling the bad parts of family history is really important, because the oscillating narrative can exist without the downs. And what we learned is that a lot of families, well, I don't want to tell the bad times. Now, I'm not saying to say the terrible times or the tragic times that, based upon the age of a child, are going to be very upsetting. But as kids grow older, the stories get more complete. But we do need to have them hear the negative components of the family narrative. Yeah, Dad lost a job. Mom was sick for a long time and couldn't take care of you when you were a baby, or things like this. Bad times give the good times some power. So we did learn that, and Bruce Feiler has really fostered this notion of telling the family stories and transmitting the family stories, because it ties families together, it binds us. And can I still say to you, that's exactly what makes kids more resilient, the fact they belong to a tightly bound family, which is pulled together by stories. I think that's a component. I think that's certainly there. But there's also an awareness. And this is, I just want to sort of come to a close before we have some questions. There's also an awareness that I belong to a group of people that has certain characteristics. My family gives to charity. My family attends religious services or not. My family is concerned about the environment. My family eats well. My family is honest. And just think about this: when children come to places in their life where they need to make decisions that are very difficult for them to make, they don't make them on their own. If they're tempted to do something that's dishonest, or that might be kind of embarrassing to a family, they say to themselves, I come from a family that doesn't do that kind of stuff. Or if there's an opportunity to help someone, I come from a family that helps people. So the situation, even though it's brand new to the child, is prepared for because of the family stories that they received. And this is the importance of the intergenerational self, the identity of myself as part of a family which owns a story that is given to me as I grow up. And it's a story that I'm responsible for. It's expected that I will pass the story on, but it's also a story I'm responsible to, meaning that I need to behave in such a way that I fit with this story that has been given to me. So that's why the stories are important. I think I'm going to stop there. I'm looking at the time. I want to be sure we have enough time for questions. If anybody has any or comments, I'd love to hear stories about your stories if that's something you'd like to share. And you can type those in the chat box, I think, and my dear friend Cole will help with that.
Yes,
So
we have a great
questions?
question to start with from Pat. What about mixed families? Families in which siblings, and I will also say other members of the family, have very different narratives.
Okay, good question. Thank you, Pat. I knew it was coming. It's a question that has to be asked. And I would extend it to blended families, adopted children. What about those stories? What we found is that a story can be given to a child because the child is now part of the family. So if we have a blended family, there may be 2 sets of stories. There may be 4 sets of stories. The more stories that seem to sort of blend together, I think the better, because that provides more situations which a child knows about in terms of how people have dealt with these kinds of situations, be they good or bad. Adopted kids, I have an adopted child. I have 2 natural or biological children. My adopted son knows the family of his biological mother, and he knows our story, and he has both of them because we give him the story. This is not uncommon, that people who have not really lived a story or even been connected to a place for a long period of time, it's not uncommon for them to have a story. If any one of you, I'll give you some examples. Stories are about families, but they're also about places. They're about cities. They're about countries. They're about cultures. So it may not surprise you that my grandchildren have gone to the University of Georgia because their father and grandfather all have gone to the University of Georgia. But when my grandchildren, who in the past 10 years went to the University of Georgia, even though they weren't there in 1980 when Herschel Walker led the Bulldogs to the national championship, they still have that as part of their history. They have Herschel Walker. They have the national championship, even though they weren't anywhere around. Likewise, a family of an adopted child can give the child the family story, and it has just the same impact if the child owns the story. Blended families, same sort of thing. Now, are there family secrets that are not transmitted to kids? Should there be some? Yes. There are some things that we make good judgment about. You say, well, that's best to just let it be and let it pass away with a generation. There are stories like that, and we have to. So I'm not saying in a blanket way, tell them everything, because that would be foolish. But at different stages of life, kids can hear different things. So the stories, they can be like a city story. Atlanta has a city story. There's city stories in Detroit. Ann Arbor has city stories. And so people who move to those places get to have the story of the city as well. Now, I'm in the South, I'm in Atlanta, so I've only been here for 50 years, so I'm still a Yankee. But I'm allowed to sort of feel like I have the stories of the city of Atlanta, that Martin Luther King is somebody who lived in my town. But it's just a town I'm living in because I'm a Yankee, but that's a very Southern kind of thing. But churches have stories, synagogues have stories. Communities have stories. All of these are transmittable and have a way of creating an identity for us, which is in fact strengthening. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, I think that was fantastic. Our next one from Jeffrey Bernstein. Have you identified any characteristics of stories, he uses the example of immigration stories, that are more likely to be passed on than others? Anything that will last throughout generations longer than other family stories?
Wonderful, wonderful question. Stories stories of immigration are central, in fact, to the stories of almost all American families. We are, as we know, a nation of immigrants. And save for the African Americans who did not come here voluntarily, the majority of people in this country have come through ancestors who left somewhere and came here. Now, there have been some theories that have been written about why Americans are so fiercely independent, why so many of us refuse to wear a mask or refuse to do what other people ask us to do. Is because as a people, we are descended from individuals who would not do what other people wanted. And as a group, we come from people who've left places and say, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to leave, or I'm not going to go along with it. And there's, whether or not this is accurate, but it goes to the national character. Immigration stories are deep root stories, very deep root stories. And many people build their entire family narrative on before we came to this country and after we came to this country. And the narrative is one that affects all of the generations that occur or appear after the immigration took place. They are shared stories, and yes, they are important. And sometimes they are incomplete. Sometimes they're very short, just a little bit of an awareness that something happened, that somebody came through Ellis Island or through Canada or through Mexico or whatever, however people came to the country. These stories are passed on. In fact, they're some of the most common sources of identity. And this is why people, even though people want to become Americanized and adopt the culture, people also want to hold on to the links that they have with the original culture. And many people, when they grow to be adults, even though they were not born in other countries, will go back to the places where their ancestors were before they came here. So it drives a lot of behavior, it drives a lot of identity. But immigration stories, some good, some bad, are present in just about everybody when we look at the big moments that are transmitted through the narratives. So they're important. They also become a way of going above individual group differences. You know, a group might have come from Ireland in 1848, but another group may have come from Russia in 1890. Different reasons, different cultures, but all immigrants facing the same kinds of experiences that immigrants face anywhere. So I hope that answers that question.
Another one from this time from the chat, talking about narrative therapy, asking clients to kind of recreate a narrative of their life to help wounds and issues in the past. Do you look at that as a model for what you were researching, and that family life stories can help build resilience?
A great question. When you talk about narrative therapy, I think immediately of a man named Michael White. I mean, maybe referring to Michael White, passed away at far too young an age, lived in New Zealand. And he really developed something officially called narrative therapy. And yes, in narrative therapy, what people do is they tell their life stories. And in the strict form of narrative therapy, they tell their life stories to other people, not just to their families, but to other people who are trained listeners. And what happens is that they tell their story and the other people listen. And then after they've told their story, they sit quietly and the listeners now tell their story back to them. It's a way of really sharpening our awareness of how it is that we perceive ourselves and how we identify ourselves based upon the stories that we carry. And I think it is an absolutely fundamental part of psychotherapy, and that is to have people come to a place where they see how the family narrative that they carry with them really affects the way they live their lives. Now, sometimes the narrative is incorrect, as I've said. Sometimes it's amplified in one place or quieted in another place. But the narrative is an important part of any effort to try and redirect someone if they're having difficulty in life, trying to find some people perhaps in their past with whom they can identify. Every family has people who have problems. I can just say that, you know, it's true. Every family has one or two relatives who had tough times, an aunt or an uncle who disappeared or never did well or broke off with the family, marriages that broke up. There are all kinds of things that happen in any real life family. And the narratives can help us to really identify those places where maybe we have looked and we've seen something in a way that could be re-examined, reframed, we might say in psychotherapeutic language. But stories, psychotherapy is storytelling. And sometimes it's a story of what happened last week, but sometimes it's a story of what happened when I was a kid. It's all storytelling.
I think I've got two questions here. You kind of touched on it, that some stories might not always be accurate. I've got two questions here that kind of go with one another. First, from Bruce, is how do you distinguish between family stories and harmful gossip? And then kind of along with that from Levi is it possible for a child to know too much negative things about their families and it can become this feeling like there's an inevitability that you will follow in bad footsteps?
Okay, so repeat the first one again to be cool.
How do you distinguish between what is a family story and what could be like harmful gossip within a family?
Okay. Let me just start with that, and then I'll ask you to repeat the other one. A family story usually is told because a lesson is needed. What I mean by that is that situations that kids are in, little kids or even older kids, when we as story carriers, storytellers, when we hear a situation, we bring up a story, and a story usually teaches a lesson. So if a child says, I'm doing terribly in math, well, grandma might say, you know, your mother had trouble in math. Let me tell you what happened. She was about your age, and a story comes out. And that same grandmother might, by the way, tell the same story about a problem in English, but stories teach lessons. This is one of the reasons why when somebody says to us, and a very wise minister or sermonizer or a speaker, if they realize they're losing the audience, will say something like, let me tell you a story, because those words get our attention. We are drawn to that. So if a story is designed to teach something and is being told for a reason, then it's a family story. If it's told just to hurt someone, then it's the other stuff. If it has no purpose in the moment or in the mind of the teller in the future, then it's different. Family stories have purpose. They teach, they immunize, they inoculate. But the other kind of stuff, as you say, idle gossip, serves no purpose. And you can see that it serves no purpose. Usually it's serving the purpose of the teller. A story from a grandmother, although it affirms the grandmother's reason for being, is for the benefit of the listener. The family story is a benefit of the listener. The gossip is for the benefit of the teller. The second question.
Yes, that related question. Even in these stories that are told to try and teach a lesson, if the lesson can be to avoid making the mistakes of a previous family member, are there times where that can become a cycle, where someone can feel like they are destined to fall into the path of these other family members that they've heard have done bad things or have made mistakes in their life?
fine question. So let me take you back to one of the original studies that was done on resilience, because I think it will answer the question that you brought up. Back in 1955, there were two social workers named Werner and Smith living on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. And they got permission from the government in the island of Kauai to contact the families of every child born on the island during 1955. And they did this, and they engaged as many of these families as they possibly could in a long-term study. Now, those of you who are psychologists or study psychology might know that there's different kinds of studies that we do. Cross-sectional studies will just sort of take a group of people and see what's going on with them right now. A longitudinal study would be one where we follow people over a long period of time, sometimes a few years, sometimes a lifetime. Well, in terms of the kids on Kauai born in 1955, it's been a lifetime. And they were interested in looking at kids who were at risk, who were born into poverty or other kinds of risk factors that were known or believed at the time. And they followed them through their lives, as well as the kids who were born to privilege. And what they found is that of the kids who were at risk, who were destined to have difficult times in their lives, about a third of them grew up to do very, very well. In other words, they were resilient. And when Werner and Smith examined why, the primary reason that they found was that someone came along in these kids' lives, somebody that they named a very important non-family adult. It might have been a teacher. Very often it's a coach, a minister, a religious leader, a community figure that connects with this child and retells the narrative. In other words, replaces the narrative. The narrative that they're born with is you're going nowhere. You start out in poverty, that's where you're going to stay. But somehow these non-family, very important VIP adults gave them a new story. It was a story of achievement. It was a story of hope, a story of optimism. And when they had this new narrative, it helped them to move through these barriers and was responsible for their getting to a better place in their lives. Now, these people now are 70, almost. They know what's happened to them. The good news is that by the time all of them were 45 or 50 years old, they were all okay, except for only two. In other words, with time, all of them found ways to live. But some had very rough times along the way, but some were incredibly resilient. So if the stories are all negative, yes, I think it can get to people. But I think that other stories can be placed against them, more optimistic narratives, realistic optimistic narratives, and with the proper kind of experience, the earlier narrative can be set aside. But a new narrative is required. And Morty mentioned Oprah before. Oprah provides new narratives for lots of people. One of her incredible strengths is, with her girls' schools that she starts, and she provides new narratives. And once the new narrative is in place, people start living that narrative. So the story that you receive is important, but it also can be altered if you have the right relationship with someone.
Thank you. We're going to do two more questions.
Fine, great.
For this one, from Charles, sometimes students say that they are anomalous in their families, different kinds of thinkings, different mindsets, things like that. Have these students been denied resilient family stories, or are they taking the stories they've heard and making them more useful for their own beliefs?
Very wise question. yes, there are kids who are anomalies in their families. They will, if they ask around among family members, find that there have been other anomalous people in their family history. And in the future, they will be the anomalous people in the family history. But what they need to realize also is that the anomaly is only felt when you are aware of the anomalous nature of who you are. In other words, you have understood the family narrative and you see how you fit or don't fit into it. And this actually helps to provide you with an identity. We are always affected by our families. Sometimes we're affected by them in that we do what they've done. Other times we are affected in that we don't do what they have done. But the story itself drives that. It's said that when we're parents, when people become parents, we are always parenting on the basis of how our parents parented us. Either we liked something they did and we'll do that with our children, or we didn't like something that they did and we would never do that with our children. But what we do or don't do is determined by the parents that we had. So I think that what he's asking about is it okay for me to see a difference between my story as I understand it from a family point of view and who I am? And they'll run parallel to each other, but they will be affecting one another all along. So the story is still a critical part of who we are, even if we decide it's not who we are. I hope that's clear.
And then I think
One last question.
very good final question from Kathy, especially with Thanksgiving coming up. Says, I live very far away from my grandchildren. I'm making YouTube videos, stories for our grandchildren, big and little stories, especially with this holiday coming up, the first one where many people will be a part. What are your recommendations for the best way to tell these stories for those of us who are far away from our loved ones?
Every grandparent is thinking about that and should. We have technology now, but I think a Zoom meeting is okay, but it's not going to be the same. We have to create something that will be marked by the pandemic. And that is that what I suggest is that we go back to some very old-fashioned kind of things, and that is creating an object that you can give to the child or to the children and create lots of them. And the thing that you write, and if we can still do it, and if they can, in other words, the kids can still read it, I would write it, but you can type it. Create something which begins, this is Thanksgiving during the pandemic of 2020. And for the first time in my memory, I can't be with you. But I am writing something that's sort of like a letter to you about what this day is like, so that in the future we can both sit down and reminisce about it. The thing that Robin Fibish has begun to study is reminiscence. And reminiscence, it turns out, storytelling is telling stories, but reminiscing is sitting together and going over memories. And what I think is going to happen is that we'll remember some of the things about what is going on right now, but we'll forget a lot of it too, as soon as we get out of the houses and we can get back to some semblance of normality. But while we're experiencing this pandemic acutely, I think we all need to take some time, even if it's not just for grandchildren. We need to take some time and write down what this has been like and how we coped with it and what we learned from it, both in a negative and a positive way, because I'll tell you, there's some positive things here. There are a lot of negatives, but there are some pretty neat positives that have come out of it. Take some time and find them, write them down, transmit them. This is a historic moment, not only in the history of the world, but also in the history of each one of our families. And the little kids look to the parents and the grandparents to see how we respond to it. If we sit and write a thoughtful piece and send it to them, it becomes something, especially if it's written in our own hand and they can read it, That's not going to be thrown away. There's no delete button for a note from grandma. So sit down and write and make these family treasures. So I thank you for your attention. I can't see anybody, which makes it hard for me, but I hope that you'll leave here with some sense of why the family stories are important, and that you'll continue to tell them, even if the kids say, Grandma, I know that story. If they say that, then you've succeeded because they know that story. Thank you, Marty.
I want to thank, am I on?
Yes, indeed.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Because I'm seeing you and not me. I would like to thank you all for coming this evening. And I greatly appreciate it. I want to thank Dr. Dyk for a fabulous lecture, and one that I think we can all take with us and learn a great deal from. I would like to tell you that on December 9, the Center for Jewish Studies is going to sponsor an evening called Sip and Sketch with Meg Adler. Meg Adler is a San Francisco artist, and she's going to sip some wine and talk about it and lead us through sketching Hanukkah cards while talking about the Hanukkah story. And I thought we are going to need something like that for Hanukkah, and need something like that for the end of the semester. And I think we're going to need some good fun and something, you know, not nice and heartwarming, and something that will ease us into the holidays. And so I'm hoping you can join me on December 9 for Sip and Sketch with Meg Adler. Again, I would like to thank Dr. Marshall Dyk for a truly brilliant lecture. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out. It's Thanksgiving. Please make sure you tell some great stories to your families and listen to the great stories being told by your families. And more than anything else, stay safe and be well. It's still very dangerous out there. Love you all. Have a wonderful holiday. Thank you so very much.